It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the BenQ EW277HDR. For those of you who aren't familiar with my video reviews, and those who are as well, they tend to be quite long, longer than the typical reviews you'd see on YouTube, but they're not quite as detailed as a written review. There's always a written review to accompany them. You can find a link to that in the description of the video, and also a link to information about how you can support the work that we do. The monitor uses a 27-inch VA panel, or more specifically a 27-inch AMVA, Advanced Multi-Domain Vertical Alignment panel from AU Optronics. It has a Full HD 1920 by 1080 resolution, so it's not going to win any awards in terms of pixel density. It's very much on the sort of lower end of what you can expect from a modern monitor in terms of pixel density, and you don't get a huge amount of useful desktop space to work with either, but you know, it is what it is. It's designed to be a fairly low budget monitor that's not too sort of power hungry on the GPU either. It is a 60Hz panel that this monitor uses. However, I was able to set a custom resolution of 75Hz in the NVIDIA control panel. I've got a separate video covering overclocking monitors. It's something you should do at your own risk, although this is what I consider a mild overclock. It didn't present any degradation in image quality, and it's quite common for Full HD monitors of this sort of type to be perfectly fine running at 75Hz. It does give a few advantages in terms of decreased perceived blur and increased connected feel, as I'll explore a little bit later in the review. I'm now going to talk a bit about the external features of the monitor. It has a very light matte anti-glare screen surface, which handles glare effectively, not as effectively as some stronger matte anti-glare screen surfaces, but on the flip side, you don't get such a grainy look to the image. It's better at preserving clarity and vibrancy compared to those stronger matte screen surfaces. It has a matte medium grey bottom bezel and similar material used on the stand base. I prefer that to glossy plastics myself. I don't like sort of fingerprint magnet glossy plastics, although there is a bit of glossy plastic used on the stand neck there. This thing here is a sensor unit, which is explored in the OSD video, and the OSD controls there also explored in the OSD video. And I suppose I should mention this little HDR and brightness intelligence plus symbol that sort of has a copper colour, slightly shiny look to it there, so I wouldn't say it exactly stands out too much. It's quite well blended with the rest of the monitor, but it is something to note. The bezel design is the usual dual stage bezel, so there's a very thin panel border around the outside of the monitor, which sort of blends in when it's switched off, but there's also a very thin hard outer component to the bezel, the plastic there, which is sort of a black plastic. The panel border becomes visible when the monitor is switched on. At the rear of the monitor, it's mainly matte textured black plastic with a sort of brushed look. There's a little bit of glossy plastic used for the BenQ logo, and also lower down for the stand neck and the bottom region there. There are no vessel holes, as I mentioned before. The included stand offers tilt as the only ergonomic flexibility. It can be easily removed, the screen from the stand, using this little button there, but that's just for transport purposes. You can't really mount it in any other way without some very clever sort of device. The port area is found here. The ports face backwards, and they include two HDMI 1.4 ports. There's no need for HDMI 2 on this monitor, it's just a 60Hz Full HD monitor. There's a VGA port, a 3.5mm headphone jack and 3.5mm line-in, and a DC power input. So the monitor does have an external power brick, which I've got just here. It's quite a small, quite a compact design. There's also speaker grills either side of the ports, so they're integrated speakers on this monitor. Again, they're explored in the review, a little bit about the sound quality there. and there's a Kensington slot as well. I'm now running a game, Wolfenstein 2 The New Colossus, just for a little bit of variety. I didn't want to run Dirt or Battlefield 1, which I usually run. And I'm going to talk a bit about the contrast performance of the monitor. Be aware, as with all of the sections of this review, what you see depends on your own monitor and also the processing done by my camera and software, YouTube, etc, etc. So this is just sort of a prompt for me to be able to talk through certain things. But I mean, clearly with a VA panel you'd expect contrast to be one of the main advantages, and indeed that is the case here. It has, I mean, I measured with my test settings around 3,500 to 1 as a static contrast ratio, which exceeds the specified 3,000 to 1, and at any rate is much better than you'd get from any non-VA LCD panel. It gives dark scenes in games, such as this one, a really good atmosphere. You don't have that sort of IPS glow which you get on IPS type panels. Unlike TN models, you don't get a kind of gradient where you get an obvious gamma shift across the screen from the top to the bottom, which sort of messes up the atmosphere as well, particularly towards the bottom of the screen where it would look kind of light and flooded. So it's a lot more consistent. And yeah, I mean, dark areas on this game, for example, the shadowed areas look nice and dark. But one weakness of VA panels in terms of contrast is something that people would refer to as black crush. And what this means is that very dark shades that are a little bit lighter than black but still very dark appear sort of darker than they should from a normal viewing position. So you're in front of the monitor as the camera is now and as I am. That means that some of the very dark shades actually appear darker than they should and sort of blend into black. They blend into a dark mass, and that can mask some subtle detail. To give you an example of this, there's a shadow over the brickwork there, and the black crush on this model isn't actually bad at all for a VA panel, and I can still see those bricks. Again, I don't know how it's going to appear on the video, but it's a fairly subtle detail for some dark shades which you can still see. And it's all about the perceived gamma of VA models. In fact, if you view these particular elements so they're not right in the centre of the screen, so they're towards the edge of the screen, the black crush lessens as well, the perceived gamma changes, and they're not masked in the same way. But I mean, as I say, it's not really a bad amount of black crush for a VA model at all. I mean, it's perhaps a little bit more than I've seen from the curved Samsung panels, but I mean, it's pretty close to them really. It's not bad at all. Another aspect of VA models, I did mention IPS glow before, which IPS models have, and that gives you sort of an obvious haziness. I mean, yes, you can see haze at the bottom, that's just an effect of the game, it's not anything to do with glow. But IPS models have an obvious glow which eats away at detail in the sections which it affects, for example the bottom corners of the screen most prominently from a normal viewing position. This model, it's VA, and VA models do have something called VA glow, but that is a lot weaker than IPS glow. And from a normal viewing position on this model, I almost forgot to mention it because it is so subtle on this model, it's virtually not there at all. It's virtually, it's pretty much not even worth mentioning. It's actually a lot lower than the curved Samsung models. They have VA glow and it's more noticeable on them than it is on this from the same viewing position. Just a quick addition actually to the contrast section. As I did mention earlier when I had the monitor off, the screen surface is very light matte anti-glare. And one of the things that means is that the bright elements such as this have a nice smooth look to them. There's no obvious graininess. I mean, this is sort of one of the smoothest matte screen surfaces you'll come across, and there's really very little graininess. There isn't even an obvious sort of light misty graininess as you get with some light matte screen surfaces. Things really do appear very smooth, and that's something I really appreciate as well. I'm now going to talk about colour reproduction, and I like to start off this section with the Lagom test for viewing angles because they help highlight the weaknesses and strengths that I'm talking about in a way that is not always obvious in games. So the Lagom text test is a good test for the viewing angle dependency of the gamma curve of the monitor. As I said in the previous section about contrast, VA models have issues with gamma handling, especially when you're looking at them from directly in front. The central region of the screen has a different perceived gamma to the edges and the bottom of the screen. In the Lagom text test, you can actually see a kind of more masked, blended appearance to the text in the middle of the screen versus around it. It's sort of like a bit of a circle, and that circle, it moves around as you move the camera or you move your eyes. That's the kind of thing that causes the black crush I mentioned. It also affects lighter shades and the perception of them as well. It's not like a TN model where you'd see obvious flashes between sort of red and green and orange for the Lagom text. It appears more of a sort of blended colour, and on this model has an obvious sort of red tint to the striping, but it doesn't flash between red and green like TN models, where there'd be an obvious gradient from the top to the bottom of the screen due to obvious vertical viewing angle weaknesses. If you look at it, this is a solid purple colour. Again, I don't know how it's going to appear on the video, but to my eye I can see that it has a more obvious pink region towards the flanks and the bottom of the screen, sort of more of a lilac colour a bit further up. And if you move your head or you move your camera, the pink sheen shifts around quite readily with head movement. It's again just one of these sort of weaknesses in colour consistency and viewing angle performance, which is typical for VA models. And as I mentioned in more detail in the written review, the AMVA panels such as this model uses, it's actually not bad at all for viewing angles and colour consistency. Certainly isn't up to IPS levels, but it's beyond what you'd get from some other VA models. That doesn't include Samsung's curved VA models or their SVA models, but some older VA panels and panels you'll see used on the likes of the AOC Q3279 VWF, for example, they're weaker in terms of colour consistency than this. This is another shade, red. I think the colour consistency of this particular shade is actually really good on this monitor. It's pretty much as good as I've seen on a VA model. It's a sort of a striking red throughout. There's a little bit of a pink fringe towards the edge, and yes, the saturation does change a bit as you move your head, so it's not entirely consistent, but it's not bad either. And the same with green. It's a fairly sort of deep, slightly yellowish green, actually doesn't have as much yellowing as you'd expect, but that's because the colour gamut of this monitor is very generous, which is something I'll come on to very shortly when I show you games. When I said running some games, I actually meant I'll be running a game, Battlefield 1, and that's because it's a title I'm very familiar with. I've tested a lot of monitors with, and it has a nice variety, a nice palette of colours, generally supposed to look quite natural, but some good vibrant shades in the mix as well. Now this model, it does display things in a very vivid way, not vivid as an obvious, horribly oversaturated, cartoonish way, but certainly in a vibrant way. And a large part of that is down to the colour gamut of the monitor, which is very generous. It's quite close to DCI P3. It's well beyond the standard sRGB colour space, and those of you who are switched on and engaged with these kind of things will know that DCI P3 is a Digital Cinema Initiatives standard, which is proposed as the near-term standard for HDR at the moment. And this monitor is running SDR at the moment. It is HDR capable, and I'll come on to that shortly, but the monitor in the game is currently running an SDR. Now this game is sort of designed to look, or was designed as most games are, with the sRGB colour gamut in mind. And when you've got a more generous colour gamut than that, shades do appear more saturated than they should. It's not the same as increasing digital vibrance, and it's not the same as an absolutely extreme colour gamut, especially Adobe RGB, which extends more than this in the green region. And I should mention that doesn't just affect green shades, because lots of shades have some amount of green in them, and when you stretch the colour gamut as much as Adobe RGB in that region, it sort of makes things look cartoonish, as I said before. But this model doesn't have the cartoonish look. It does have a deeply saturated look, but because it's achieved with a large colour gamut rather than just stretching shades towards the edge of the gamut, which is what NVIDIA Digital Vibrance Control or similar vibrancy type controls on monitors do, it maintains a really good shade variety as well. So there are lots of nice sort of earthy browns which look nice and neutral. They have a slightly red tint to them, which is one of the things you get when you have an extended colour gamut like this. Some of the green shades do look deeper than they should, more lush than they should, but again there's a good range, so there are some more muted shades in the mix as well. And I mean, overall, I think that most users would find this sort of vivid look appealing, and certainly the fire and explosions, the sort of bright orange shades, look very vibrant and stand out very nicely. But there is oversaturation there. Just thinking about the fire, for example, the oranges look a deeper orange than they should. Some of the yellows verge on orange, and some of the deeper oranges sort of have a slight red look to them. But again, the shade variety is maintained, so you do get a palette of yellows and oranges and reds. It's not all crushed together. And I think many users would find this quite appealing. The colour gamut is better tamed if you're running an HDR, which I'm going to come on to now. And that means that the colour gamut, the game, the content actually maps more appropriately to the extended colour gamut. I'm now running the game in HDR, and again you're not going to be able to really see the obvious difference in the video, or you're not likely to see the difference represented in an accurate way, but the colour gamut is now mapped more appropriately. Things do still look vivid, and it's up to the game developer how they want things to look in HDR, but they know they're now targeting the DCI P3 colour space for their content, because that's what most HDR displays are going to be sort of aiming towards at the moment. So they can make things less saturated if they want, and they can also put in some very highly saturated shades as well. But just general observations about HDR in this model. I mean, it does sort of the colour side of things really nicely. I should mention, I mean, I didn't really mention the SDR section, but I did mention with the Lagom website that colours lose a bit of saturation towards the edges and the bottom of the screen, and that is, again, it's not particularly bad for a VA model at all on this model, but there is a bit of a loss of saturation, so these green shades look a bit less lush towards the edge and the bottom of the screen, but overall they do look vivid, and because the colour gamut is so generous, it kind of it prevents it looking washed out even in the extremities of the screen, so that's good. And from this sort of viewing distance, I tend to view this model from sort of 70 to 80 centimeters away. The sort of the change in the shifts in the saturation are pretty low from that range on this panel. And I mean, I do have to commend AUO who make the panel. They have done a very good job at keeping the colour consistency really quite good for a VA model, and it looks pretty rich throughout the screen, even if there are some changes in saturation levels. The other aspect of HDR, high dynamic range, and really the more important aspect of HDR, is the contrast performance. Ideally, the screen would be able to display very dark, deep shades and very bright, light, bright shades at the same time. And to achieve that, it would need to ideally have per pixel illumination, as you'll get on an OLED display, for example, or it would have a lot of dimming zones on the backlight. It would have a full array local dimming solution, perhaps, ideally with thousands of dimming zones, but generally not so many these days. And that would help it to achieve some areas of the screen looking very dark and other areas looking very bright. This model doesn't have that kind of solution. For my testing, it would suggest that it might have a very limited local dimming solution, sort of an edge light solution with a certain number of dimming zones. I wasn't really able to ascertain exactly how many, but the reason I think it might have some is simply that the static contrast is a little bit higher in HDR. I actually measured, I think it was around 4,500 to 1 rather than 3,500 to 1. So it does have a little bit of an edge in contrast, and essentially what it's done, the black level stays much the same, but the maximum luminance is increased from 300 candelars per meter squared, a bit more actually, to a bit over 400 candelars per meter squared, whilst the black depth remains the same at that brightness level. So the black depth isn't bad because it's a VA model, so you don't get a completely flooded look, but I do notice when I'm running HDR that overall things just do look bright. The backlight is clearly running at a very high brightness, especially when it's trying to incorporate these really bright elements, and those bright elements do look quite bright, but you don't get the kind of contrast you'd ideally get in HDR, where the darker elements really look deep and the bright elements stand out in a brilliant way. It's just that overall things look quite bright, and it doesn't really have the proper high dynamic range look to it for that reason. The moon up there, for example, it does look very bright, can't deny that, but I've used models which do use full array local dimming or more advanced dimming solutions, and this dark area there, it looks a lot lighter. I wouldn't really say flooded, but it just doesn't have the depth on this model that it should have, and therefore it doesn't contrast as well with these brighter elements. Another aspect of HDR, it's more really related to colour reproduction, but sort of in this context is still relevant, is that HDR displays are supposed to use 10-bit per pixel colour processing, or at least 10-bit. This model is a true 8-bit panel, uses a true 8-bit panel. It doesn't support 10-bit colour reproduction with or without dithering or anything higher than that, but because the HDR signal does use a higher bit depth, the monitor essentially compresses that higher bit depth. I think it's 12-bit on the NVIDIA GPU I'm testing at the moment with the HDR on this model. So it uses the 12-bit colour signal on the GPU, and then it's compressed into 8-bit colour output. So it doesn't really have the same sort of precision with the shades, mapping the shades as it ideally would have. But to me that difference, yeah, it's a difference, but to me it's not really as significant as the difference that would be made if it had full array local dimming backlight or per pixel illumination. So in my mind this is very sort of a pretty weak HDR experience really. It's nice that they can map the colour gamut appropriately, and the monitor does have decent but not extreme brightness. And I mean, some users, especially those who haven't really experienced better HDR, they might find this a nice little addition, and they might enjoy using this monitor in HDR, and that's great. But as a seasoned reviewer, I have certainly come across some better HDR implementations. I mean, I should say for balance, I've also come across some worse ones as well. I'm now running Battlefield 1, and I'm going to talk about responsiveness. I'm currently running a map on Battlefield 1 which is particularly good at highlighting weaknesses in pixel responsiveness on VA panels such as this. It has lots of dark shades, and it's these dark shades, when they're involved in the transitions, that VA models are typically very weak at. In fact, all VA models have some weaknesses when it comes to dark transitions. They do vary. Some have more widespread weaknesses, affecting a greater range of shades, and with some the weaknesses are even more pronounced, as in there's really slow transitions, whereas on some they're just a bit slow. So there is a lot of variation. Now this model, it performs most of its pixel transitions, particularly with the lighter shades, as fast as you can expect, and gives an optimal 60 Hz performance. So as I explore in the review and in my responsiveness article, most of the perceived blur you see on a monitor actually comes from the movement of your own eyes, and no matter how fast the pixel responsiveness is, you will get a certain degree of perceived blur, which is highly tied to the refresh rate of the monitor. So there's no point in having an actual 1 millisecond response time for all of the transitions, and specified response times are massively misleading anyway. This does have a 4 millisecond response time specified, but that's, again, it's completely misleading and you can really pay pretty much no attention to that. So the weaknesses come from these dark transitions. So you can see on this horse, for example, there are lots of dark shades, and there are somewhat brighter shades in the background around the horse for the sky and the desert as well. So if you move across near the horse, you can see a bit of a fringe around it. There's a sort of slightly colourful trailing. That's what I call breakup trailing. And what that is there are colours, although it appears pretty much black, these really dark shades, when you're actually viewing the monitor or even on the video perhaps, that they actually have some slight hues of different colours in, and those hues basically leach out. It's because the pixel transitions are a fair bit slower than optimal for these very dark shades. So a bit of that shade leaks out in a sort of colourful fashion, a bit like you've wet a page with some ink from a fountain pen, and it sort of, it smears out. I know some of you won't even know what a fountain pen is, but basically it's an old school pen. So if you wet the ink on the page, it sort of leaches out into the water. So that's that kind of effect. It's really not too bad. On some VA models, there'd actually be an obvious smoke-like trail, so it would extend way beyond the object. On this model, it's much more constrained than that. And on some models, the colours that come out will be really eye-catching, really bright. On this model, it really isn't. I don't find it so eye-catching. Sensitivity to this does vary, however. Further weaknesses you can explore on this map. It's not just this map, I should mention. These dark shades do occur on much brighter maps as well, in shaded areas and that kind of thing. So it's not just on dark maps. But if you've seen my other videos where I point out these weaknesses, you'll see that there's often quite a lot of weakness in this area. On this model, again, there's a little bit of the breakup trailing, but it's just a bit of a sort of slightly colourful fringe. It's not extreme. And it's difficult for me to know exactly how this is going to come out in the video, because it sometimes isn't picked up very well on the video. You can often see a sort of trail around the telegraph post. This is always a weakness on VA models, this transition here. I've never found a model that doesn't have some degree of weakness here. So you can see a little bit of trailing there. Again, sort of colourful breakout trailing. And it's not so easy to capture on the video, but there are some transitions, particularly between medium shades, where the pixel transitions are a bit slower than optimal. They're not as slow as the ones that cause the breakout trailing, but they do add a bit to perceived blur. I could go deeper into this map and try and show you other transitions. There's also a little bit of overshoot on this monitor. You can't really, it really is a little bit. It's very hard to find specific examples, particularly on this map. But sometimes where there are sort of various medium shades, you'll actually see a slight little bit of bright trailing around an object. You can see a little bit here actually, or I can. It probably won't come out in the video because it's really very weak. But there's actually a trail which is brighter than the background colour and the object colour, and that's overshoot, inverse ghosting. But there's not really very much of that on this model. I didn't have any distracting overshoot. And it's not just this game I've played loads of games on this monitor. I've used it extensively, and I really don't think overshoot's an issue with this model. Not an issue I'd worry about anyway. I'd like to end with a slight sort of positive note. You can also run this monitor at high refresh rates, 75 Hz. This is actually overclocking the monitor. It doesn't have this as a listed resolution, so you do have to create a custom resolution, essentially overclocking the monitor. It's a native 60 Hz panel. So if you're running it at 65 Hz and you've got your frame rate keeping up, so you've got ideally 75 frames a second, you get a bit of a better connected feel when you're interacting with the game world than at 60 Hz and 60 frames a second. It just gives you a little bit of an edge, and it feels a bit nicer. And it also decreases the perceived blur for the most of the pixel responses, which are fast enough for sort of an optimal performance at 60 Hz, most of them are also optimal at 75 Hz as well. So you do get a decrease in perceived blur overall, but it doesn't improve those weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. And in fact, when you increase the refresh rate, the requirements for pixel responsiveness actually increases, and because the sort of main perceived blur due to eye movements decreased, the sort of weaknesses stand out a bit better. It's more extreme when you increase the refresh rate more. So for example, if you're on a 144 Hz monitor and you're comparing 60 Hz to 144 Hz, you'll get some really pronounced differences. On this model, 675 Hz, I find it pretty similar in terms of these weaknesses which I've explored. Perhaps some of them are a little bit more obvious, just because of the decrease in perceived blur elsewhere, but I don't really find that a big issue, and I do prefer running it at 75 Hz. But I should mention, as with overclocking any component, mileage may vary. I've had a lot of experience with overclocking full HD monitors like this, especially when they're connected with HDMI, and it's pretty common for you to be able to set it to at least 72 Hz, if not 75 Hz, without any issues. And on this model, I didn't have any degradation in image quality or anything like that, no frame skipping at 75 Hz. But it depends on your GPU, and there could be a bit of inter-unit variation with the models, the monitors themselves as well. So there are no guarantees in that respect. To wrap up then, the BenQ EW277HDR puts in a competent performance in many key areas. Its particular strength is contrast, as you'd expect from a VA panel, but even amongst VA panels it's quite a good performer. It offers static contrast, which is a bit above the specified 3000 to 1, but also it delivers an experience which is free from any sort of annoying glow. There's no real VA glow to talk about, and the screen surface is very light matte anti-glare with a very smooth finish to it, so it keeps the experience free from any annoying graininess even when you're observing light colours such as white. And it's the colour performance is good overall as well. It offers a very generous colour gamut, extending well beyond sRGB and coming pretty close to DCI-P3. The colour consistency, there are some weaknesses, as you'd expect from any VA panel. It's not up to the level of IPS type panels, and for that reason I wouldn't recommend it for photo editing so much, or any other colour critical work really. But the colour consistency is by no means bad for the panel type, it's actually very good for the panel type. The losses of saturation towards the bottom and the edges of the screen are relatively subtle for most shades, and such that you won't really notice it when you're gaming and just using the monitor generally, watching films and that kind of thing. And even where the saturation weakens a bit, the saturation does remain strong thanks to the colour gamut. So if you like sort of vibrant looking colours, not vibrant as in sort of cartoonish and looking completely wrong, but just a bit of extra vibrancy but still pretty accurately represented overall, then this monitor can certainly deliver a nice experience for you. One of the headline capabilities of this monitor is HDR, or High Dynamic Range. It's even in the model name, EW277HDR. It's got a little shiny HDR logo as well and a button which can be used to quickly activate and deactivate the mode, but it's really not a fantastic HDR implementation. It's not the worst I've seen. It does seem to split the backlight into multiple dimming zones, although very few dimming zones. It manages to increase the maximum luminance to by about 33%. I mean, BenQ markets that, and that's quite what I measured. So it takes it to a bit above 400 candles per meter squared instead of just above 300 candles per meter squared. That's not as bright as some HDR screens go, but it's pretty bright. On the flip side, the black point itself actually remains similar to in SDR with the monitor at full brightness. It depends on the content you're looking at, but this is where you've got sort of bright, brilliant flashes on the screen, such as fire, explosions, that kind of thing. The dark content doesn't really look very deep. It doesn't exactly look flooded, but it doesn't look as deep as it should for HDR, and you don't really get that extreme contrast between the light and the dark shades that HDR really calls for. The colour gamut, as I said, is very generous. It's quite near DCI P3, and for that reason it does actually provide a good HDR colour experience. It sort of has an appropriate gamut for that kind of content. It doesn't offer true 10-bit colour or any sort of 10-bit processing with dithering either, so it's not exactly ideal in that respect, but I mean, some people might like the HDR experience, especially if you haven't seen a better implementation, but it's certainly not a reason I would buy this monitor. The responsiveness of the monitor, it's pretty decent actually given the panel type. It does have some distinct weaknesses. All VA models have some distinct weaknesses, and this one is it's not too bad actually. So in terms of responsiveness, I think quite a few users would actually find it okay, even users who do find some VA models too slow. And I was also able to overclock it to 75 Hz, which helped give a bit of a better connected feel and also slightly decreased the perceived blur. I mean, it didn't help out with the slow pixel transitions, and actually if you increase the refresh rate, sometimes they can become a bit more obvious. But in this case, it wasn't a big difference in terms of that you'd notice, but it was really the feel. It felt a bit more responsive at 75 Hz. But as I've mentioned elsewhere, mileage may vary when it comes to overclocking different units, different graphics cards, etc. So I'm not saying that it'll get a guaranteed 75 Hz, but in my experience with these kind of models, it's pretty common to be able to get that kind of refresh rate. So yeah, it ticks a lot of boxes. It offers good all-round performance, and I think for the price point that it goes at, it's really quite a good screen. If you like strong contrast, you don't mind a few weaknesses in responsiveness, and you like vivid colours. So that's about all there is to the BenQ EW277HDR. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video. There's also a link to information about how you can support the work that we do.